Today's episode is sponsored by Trading 212, the platform bringing commission-free investing to everyone. Welcome to Many Happy Returns, where we aim to make you a better investor. I'm Roman.
And I'm Michael.
Donald Trump's trade war has begun, or has it? Markets breathed a sigh of relief as sweeping tariffs on Mexican and Canadian goods were suspended at the 11th hour.
But with tariffs on China now in force and Beijing hitting back, will the reprieve be short-lived? And in today's dumb question of the week, how do you measure the strength of a currency? All right, let's get into it. So I think the first thing to say is we're recording on Tuesday morning, the 4th of February. Had we recorded in our usual slot yesterday, Roman, I think everything we just said would have been out of date. But hopefully this will be pretty relevant by the time you listen to it.
Yeah, I'm sure the situation will be completely stable and normal over the next 4 years.
Over the next 24 hours, I was hoping. But where we are now is that the tariffs that were meant to come in on Mexico and Canada have been suspended. But I think it's still worth talking about what those tariffs were going to be and the effect they could have had.
And may yet be, because remember, this is a reprieve rather than a complete reversal of the tariffs.
Oh yeah, it's just a 30-day suspension, isn't it? But they were massive tariffs that were being proposed. So on imports of goods from Canada and Mexico, they were going to be subject to a 25% tariff, which is enormous, like really, really huge. The exception would have been energy products from Canada, things like oil, which would have only faced a 10% tariff. And these tariffs were due to come in on Tuesday at midnight. And at the very last minute, Trump was on the phone to the Mexican president and then to the Canadian president and supposedly got enough concessions from them around what's going on at the border with undocumented migrants and drug trafficking that he was comfortable suspending these tariffs. What did you make of it all?
It's really hard to tell whether this is some amazingly clever scheme in order to make America great again, or it's just the rantings of a crazy person.
Why not both? But at least the explicit justification that Trump had given for these tariffs was that there was huge amounts of fentanyl coming over the border, particularly from Mexico. And, you know, that is causing a real effect in America. There's tens of thousands of people dying each year. I don't want to downplay that. That's less relevant to the Canadian border, though, because it's something like 66,000 pounds of fentanyl come over the southern border from Mexico each year and around 70 pounds from the Canadian border. But hey, the same justification was used for both of these things. And I think he had to use this kind of justification, so he was allowed to trigger what's called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which enables him to bring in tariffs without the say-so of Congress.
Now, I suspect if you're someone that lives on the US border with Mexico, you're probably thinking this isn't a bad idea because they suffer the sharp end of what this kind of migration means. And part of that is the drugs problem. And yeah, it's killing Americans and something has to be done about it. But is this going to remove the demand for these drugs? And will the drugs traffickers find a way around these blocks? Well, probably while the demand is there.
Do you think we've gone from the war on drugs to the trade war on drugs? It seems an unusual negotiating ploy, doesn't it? To use tariffs on goods imports to try and affect change on these kind of very specific policies at the border.
But this is how I think you could use tariffs if you're the United States. It's a dangerous game, and I think it could cause problems down the road. But using tariffs like a cudgel to try and get people to do stuff which is in your interest, yeah, that would work for Mexico, it'll work for Canada, but would it work for Germany? Probably not as effectively, or the UK, or even China. Because if you look at Mexican exports, 81% of them go to the US, and for Canada it's 76%. So for those two countries, this is a massive deal.
I mean, they were certainly scrambling, weren't they, to get on the phone to Trump and try and agree something, just to avoid the immediate hit of tariffs. So what they've agreed to is Mexico is going to ramp up its actions at the border, 10,000 members of the National Guard going there on a kind of fentanyl watch. In return, they've asked the US to crack down on the smuggling of high-powered weapons into Mexico, which is obviously not helping their battle against the cartels. On the Canadian side of things, Canada says it's implementing a $1.3 billion border plan with new helicopters, technology personnel, drones, and the appointment of a fentanyl czar. Now, that is a job I will be applying for, Robin. I've always wanted to be a fentanyl czar.
So there's job creation here as well.
Yeah, of course. But I think these are the kind of things it's not too hard for Mexico and Canada to agree to. I think in Trump's first term, actually, Mexico did something quite similar.
I guess if you're at the sharp end of these tariffs, then you're thinking, well, what's going to happen after Trump? You know, I can put up with this for 4 years, but is the next president going to think along similar lines? Because that could be a problem. Because this is going to be a drain on Mexican resources. It's going to be a drain on Canadian resources.
What, in terms of putting personnel at the border?
Yeah, maybe it's something that they're going to roll back in 4 years' time. Maybe that's the way they're looking at it.
Oh, come on, it's a small price to pay, isn't it, to avoid these huge tariffs? I mean, the thing that really I'm wondering about is, what's Trump really after here? Obviously, he has to talk about fentanyl and illegal migration to be able to use his powers. But is that really the justification for this kind of thing? It's kind of a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And when you listen to what he's talking about, he's generally talking about massive trade deficits and rebalancing of trade.
And look, I think some of his points are right. I think that China does have unfair trade with the US and with other countries around the world. It doesn't protect IP rights. It forces technology transfer. That's still the case, although it is getting a bit better, apparently. So I think that one's justified. And if anyone's going to bring China to heel, it's going to be the US.
Yeah, but Canada and Mexico?
Yeah. But your allies, and it was interesting to see some of the vox pops of Canadians who were just bewildered by this. You know, I thought they were our friends. I thought they were our allies. We fought and died together in Europe in the Second World War and in the First World War. And yet you treat us like an enemy. You know, that's what it sounded like. So I think disbelief would sum up their reaction, understandably.
I mean, both Canada and Mexico were ready to respond with tariffs of their own, had there not been a deal struck at the last minute. But I think we should focus on the economic impacts here, because I think it's unquestionable they would have been severe, and they will be severe if these tariffs do eventually come into effect.
And there's a lovely quote, actually, from a book I'm reading at the moment, Trade Wars Are Class Wars, by Klein and Pettis, where he uses the example of a seatbelt put into an American-made car, and he says, the seatbelt might have its fibers manufactured in Mexico, woven and dyed in Canada to take advantage of the abundance of water, and then sent back to Mexico to be sewn up and then installed somewhere at a plant in the United States. And there was also a lovely example from Bloomberg, which tracked the course of a capacitor that was put into a US car, which again, it crossed both borders.
It's a great example, building cars, because I think people don't appreciate how tightly integrated these supply chains are across the Mexican, US, and Canadian borders, because they're in this free trade agreement together. So single components in a vehicle can cross these borders 6 to 8 times before final assembly. And one of the key points about these tariffs Trump was proposing is that the duties would be payable every single time that component enters the US. Usually you'd have something called drawback in these agreements, which allow the tariff to be adjusted based on just the value added, but that wasn't in place here. And in fact, there's actually no infrastructure to be able to put a dollar value on a lot of these components that are going in and out of the country, right? Manufacturers don't care about how much that capacitor is worth today, how much it's going to be worth in a week's time when it comes back. That's just not how it's, accounted for.
Just imagine how complex that would be for the companies, but also for the government to try and impose a tax system that takes all this into account. In theory, I guess it's possible, but it's going to be expensive to implement. And while it's not implemented, it's going to be a problem for those companies because it's going to increase prices, and that's going to reduce their margins, and it's going to be bad for their business. So there's no question that this is going to be a problem in specific sectors like manufacturing.
I mean, I saw so much pushback from the car industry saying this is going to decimate us. And there were rumors that, factories could close within 2 weeks had these tariffs gone into effect. And it would have a huge impact on the competitiveness of US-made cars in foreign markets. Because if you think about it, you're making a car in Texas, say, and all your intermediary goods, your components you're bringing in are being taxed over and over again and making them more expensive. Whereas that same car being made in Europe or China is getting components at normal cost And so which car's going to be cheaper for sale in Asia or in Europe?
And having a huge trading bloc like the EU allows this frictionless movement of the supply chains between all the countries in the EU. So you can be more competitive if you do have places where you can manufacture the components more cheaply.
Because everyone focused on the effect on consumers with tariffs. Basically inflation's going to go up. But the impact on business, I think, is even more stark. There's a quote from Jay Timmons, who's the president of the National Association of Manufacturers in America. And he said these tariffs on Canada and Mexico threaten to upend the very supply chains that have made US manufacturing more competitive globally. He says the ripple effects will be severe, particularly for small and medium-sized manufacturers. Ultimately, manufacturers will bear the brunt of these tariffs, undermining our ability to sell products at a competitive price and putting American jobs at risk.
And the point there is a good one and a really interesting one, which is that if you look at inflation, yes, after a year passes, the inflationary effects of the tariffs will drop out of the comparison window, so it'll disappear. The prices will stay higher, of course. But the relative price of US cars will remain high relative to the rest of the world. And that's not going to go away while the tariffs are in place.
It seems like the US doesn't really appreciate how important its neighbours are to it as an economy. If you think about that alliance, that economic alliance that's been built up between America, Canada, and Mexico, it kind of works together really nicely. So you've got American innovation at the heart of it. You've got Canada with all its resources and can provide those cheaply. And then you've got Mexico that can provide low-cost labour. We've got a lot of American factories that have moved to Mexico. Those three things work nicely together, don't they? Innovation, resources, and labour.
Now, look, we're strictly metropolitan elite, Michael. So, we're not used to living in the Rust Belt where you've seen jobs just dry up because of globalization. And I can see why people are angry. I can see why if you live in Pennsylvania and you're surrounded by these empty factories, then, yeah, you'd be upset about globalization, about the competitiveness of America. And it's hard to believe that the US is doing well. It's very different to someone who sits in the West Coast working for Microsoft or maybe Facebook, where they've got really high salaries and everything looks great.
Or someone who just sits in London doing a podcast looking at the GDP graphs, being really jealous of America.
For example, yeah. So I can see why Trump's base decided to vote him back into power, because they think he's going to help them get back to where they were in their parents' generation. I think that's his appeal.
It seems a stretch to expect that tariffs will result in a reshoring of manufacturing on any scale in America. I know the CHIPS Act, which Biden passed with explicit subsidies, has seen a ramping up of factory construction, which was a strategic choice and maybe a better way to go than tariffs. It's more of a carrot than a stick.
And also reduces the reliance on Taiwan, which could be a problem in the future.
Yeah. But I think in the short term, it's hard to make the case that tariffs, especially on its neighbours and allies, would do anything but hurt the economy and hurt the average person. So the tariffs as they were proposed would have raised the average rate of tariff that the US applies from around 3% currently to more than 10%, which would be the highest tariff rate since 1946. And it's hard to see that as anything other than a massive supply shock to the US economy. Economists have estimated that such a trade war could knock off 1 to 2% from US GDP and add almost a percentage point to core inflation. And significantly for consumers, it would just take money out of their pockets. So the Tax Foundation has estimated that tariffs on just Mexico and Canada would be an effective tax of more than $800 per year per US household. And the Budget Lab at Yale University has forecast that the average US household would lose around $1,000 a year in purchasing power. These are quite big numbers. And I think that's the takeaway here. The macro effect could be really big because you'd be talking about one of the biggest tax rises ever on US consumers, in theory, at the same time as Trump is talking about reining in grants and subsidies and state spending, especially with Musk's Doge going around causing chaos everywhere. These two things together could result in a big demand shock.
But if we take him literally at what he says, which sounds like a good idea at this point, then remember what he's talking about is having an external revenue service. as a counterpoint to the Internal Revenue Service, and using tariffs to pay a lot of taxes, such that he could cut those taxes, which would be quite popular, even though people would be effectively taxed because of the more expensive imports. But the mistake, I think, is assuming that you can replace current tax revenue with tariffs, and that just wouldn't be practical, as many people have pointed out. So currently the US tax take due to income taxes is around $2 trillion, and that's about half of federal revenue. Now, to match that with tariffs, you'd have to have about 60 to 80% on all imports. And of course, that's assuming that those imports don't fall as a result of the tariffs, which of course they would. The demand for those products which were imported would obviously drop if they're more expensive.
Yeah, well, but that would be if you wanted to completely eliminate income tax. But you'd want to just cut it a bit. Same with corporation tax, I assume. And if we're just looking at Canada and Mexico in isolation, those two countries account for around $1 trillion of goods imports each year, which is pretty much exactly a third of US total goods imports. And maybe one of the reasons Trump feels that he has the upper hand in these trade negotiations is that there's an imbalance really here with the importance of trade to Canada versus the US and Mexico versus the US. So almost 80% of Canadian exports go to the US, but imports from Canada only make up around 14% of total US imports. Again, with Mexico, 80% of exports are to the US and imports only account for around 15% of US total imports. So, there is an imbalance here.
There was a lovely article by Gideon Rachman in the FT where he was talking about how this may ultimately backfire for the US because trading may simply circumvent the US in the future. For example, he says, by imposing these tariffs on China, Canada and Mexico, he risks creating a convergence of interest between these three countries, as well as the EU, which has been told it's next in line for the tariff treatment. So there could be a trading bloc that effectively forms in response to these tariffs if they're imposed and kept in place.
I think that's a genuine threat and something the US doesn't take seriously enough. China has, over time, reduced its reliance on exports to the US and is now the top trading partner of, I think it's something like 120 countries around the world. So if we're talking about two separate trading blocks being built up gradually, China would happily, I think, pick off countries that are in the US sphere, if it can. I don't think it's going to be able to pick off Canada and Mexico, but some countries in Europe maybe.
And it's so funny watching the UK try to fly under the radar here because we're such a small trading partner, and poor old Keir Starmer was in Europe, and he was asked by a journalist, do you worry about trying to side with one side or another? Because obviously Trump won't want us to side with the EU. We want to keep good relationships with everyone. And we end up as a dumping ground for things like Chinese EV exports, for example, because we don't have tariffs in place.
Your driveway is a dumping ground for Chinese EV exports, Romin. I've seen it. I've ridden in
I
your
love
car.
it. Yeah. I love that car. It's really good.
I think the UK is unlikely to be anywhere near the top of the list for tariffs from the US, in large part because the trade is pretty balanced. In terms of goods, there's not really a big surplus or deficit either way. And it's actually, in one sense, maybe a slight advantage of Brexit that if we were still in the EU and Trump goes after the EU with tariffs, which he probably will, we couldn't escape that. The EU sets trade policy as a bloc. At least we can kind of try and keep our head down here.
But it's a funny situation where being irrelevant in trade terms is actually a strength for the UK. The argument previously was that if you're part of a larger bloc, then you have more heft, which is, of course, true.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting if there's a real standoff between the US and the EU. Because Trump said recently, tariffs will definitely happen with the European Union. I can tell you that because they've really taken advantage. We have over $300 billion in deficit. He said the European Union, it's an atrocity what they've done and that tariffs will happen pretty soon. He says they don't take our cars, they don't take our farm products. They take almost nothing and we take everything from them. Millions of cars, tremendous amounts of food and farm products.
So if you look at the breakdown of trade within the EU, about 60% of it is intra-EU, i.e. amongst the different countries within the EU, and about 40 is extra-EU. Now that's clearly something which is one of their strengths, which is that even if there are very severe sanctions placed on them, it's going to hurt a lot, particularly for some companies. Car exports, for example, from Germany to the US. But would it be an existential crisis for the EU? I don't think so.
I think what that overlooks is the internal tensions that would be triggered in the bloc were there to be a trade war with the US. Because not all EU countries are equally exposed to the US and to US exports. Germany has by far the most goods exports, worth almost $160 billion a year, and would clearly do everything in its power to avoid tariffs on its car industry. Whereas, let's say, Eastern European countries have incredibly tiny shares of exports to the US. In terms of their share of exports, Ireland is actually the most exposed. Around 25% of its exports go to the US. So I think you could see a situation where the EU struggles to present a united front just because of the different interests that each of their member states have.
But if you look at Germany, for example, yes, it is exposed to trade outside the bloc, but it's also got a lot of trade inside the bloc. And so I think there is a self-interest, once you're within the EU, to keep it together. And I think that'll outweigh the external threats which are posed by countries like the US. So I'm not convinced that this is going to break up the EU. I think it could cause factions within the EU to squabble, but that's always the case.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's going to break up the EU, but I think if you're looking at who's going to win a trade war, in inverted commas, the US will be united because Trump has all the power, and the EU might not be. We'll see. They'll be desperately trying to present a united front like they did in the Brexit negotiations.
Although you do get states push back on some of the tariffs. For example, I noticed that China put a tariff on whiskey, and some people noticed that that's where Mitch McConnell's state was. So, he wasn't a big fan of tariffs by any means, because it would affect his state's exports to China. So I think you do also see disunity in the United States on some of these tariffs. And there have been big pushbacks from some states which have been negatively impacted.
Yeah, I think all countries and trade blocs are going to play this game where they target politically sensitive products with tariffs. Like if Macron gets a bit outspoken, here comes 50% cheese tariffs. It's always going to be this game. I think one thing that did change this week was that Trump did admit to some extent that were he to get into this tit-for-tat trade war with all these tariffs, there is a cost to pay for the US and for American citizens. So he wrote on his social media platform that this will be the golden age of America. Will there be some pain? Yes, maybe. And maybe not.
Yeah, and just to reiterate your point about him having the upper hand, this is another quote from Trump where he says, tariffs for us, nobody can compete with us because we're the pot of gold. But if we don't keep winning and keep doing well, we won't be the pot of gold.
I think he has a point there, as in the world is so reliant on selling to US consumers. Don't you think? They're the kind of engine of growth, or at least they have been for so many years.
Yeah, I mean, consumption, that's something that the US citizen is very good at and which China's now trying to emulate, which is interesting. But if they do want to reduce the deficit, one way to do that is to consume less and save more. So maybe that'll be the shift in the US, which we'll see. But it takes a long time for those kind of cultural shifts to kick in. And I'm not convinced that it's going to happen in this presidency.
I'm not convinced that Trump, who very much flaunts his wealth, is going to say to Americans, you need to consume less. That would seem just a difficult sell.
Today's episode is sponsored by Trading 212, the platform bringing commission-free investing to everyone. Trading 212 Stocks and Shares ISA is the cheapest way to invest, with zero commission and the lowest FX fees I could find on the market. Looking to keep things simple? You can easily automate your investing with pies that allow you to rebalance your portfolio at the click of a button. Customers with Invest accounts can also benefit from the Trading 212 card, which has no FX fees, true interbank rates, and offers 0.5% cash back on all transactions up to £20 per month. Many Happy Returns listeners can claim free fractional shares worth up to £100. Just create and verify a Trading 212 Invest or Stocks ISA account, make a minimum deposit of £1, and use the promo code ROMIN, RAMIN, within 10 days of signing up or use the link in the show notes. When investing, your capital is at risk and you may get back less than invested. Past performance doesn't guarantee future results. Pies and Autoinvest is an execution-only service, not investment advice or portfolio management. Automatic investing refers to executing scheduled deposits. You're responsible for all investment and rebalancing decisions. Free shares can be fractional. 212 cards are issued by Paynetics, which provide all payment services. Trading 212 provides customer support and user interface. Terms and fees apply.
I mean, to step back, where we sit today is that these tariffs were threatened. It looked like they were going to come in and upend everything. Then they've been suspended, although the Chinese tariffs are still going to come in. I can never quite work out what the market makes of all this. Doesn't seem to have had a huge sell-off or anything.
No, there was a bit of a wobble and then it lasted 24 hours. Bitcoin dipped below 100k and then it's back up above 100k now. So yeah, very short-term negative reaction. Perhaps that's because eventually the tariffs didn't happen, so it wasn't really an event at all. But I think this narrative that markets would keep Trump in order, well, the policeman seems to be sleeping on the job.
Yeah, we needed to have a 5 or 10% sell-off and circuit breakers be triggered and stuff, I think, just to make Trump wake up. But he didn't need it, right? He suspended the tariffs and backed off anyway.
But maybe that was the plan all along.
Yeah, maybe. No one knows, right? I don't know if Trump knows. The market certainly doesn't know. And I think taking everything less seriously, I'll just wait and see what actually happens from now on.
But look, seriously, people on our chat forum were talking about how are you coping with this? Are you de-risking because of these trade policies, or are you just sticking with it? And I'd say it was pretty mixed. Some people had de-risked, some people were keeping their allocations much as they were previously. Because some people had already planned, you've got your safe cash buffer, you've got your gilts, your gilt ladder, just for these kind of eventualities.
I spoke to someone in my family who sold all of their stocks yesterday. Not necessarily because they thought these tariffs were going to be such a big deal in themselves. They thought, I just can't mentally cope with this back and forth over the next 4 years. It's not going to stop. I just need to sit in cash and get my 5%. Which I think is fair enough. Like, if that is your psychology and you're going to panic, you just say, okay, I'm sitting out the next 4 years. Maybe markets will go up a lot and I'll have a bit of FOMO, but I can sit it out.
I wonder, if you just didn't listen to news at all for the next 4 years and just carried on investing, whether you'd be better off than, really getting panicked by this kind of stuff and getting stressed out by it.
It's hard to completely ignore the news, isn't it? It's easy to say that, but it means you can never turn on the internet.
But certainly for the last week, you could have just ignored events and you'd be fine.
That's the history of the stock market, though, isn't it? In the long term, just don't pay any attention.
It's just less stressful.
I still wonder about what is the big goal here of the Trump administration. Or is there even a unifying goal? Are tariffs just the answer to everything? It wants Europe to up defense spending. Okay, if you don't do it, here are tariffs. We want to buy Greenland. If you don't do it, we'll target Danish companies with tariffs. We want less migration from Mexico. Here's tariffs until we get our way. Is it just their default response now? Do what we want, or there's tariffs?
I think so. And while they remain the pot of gold, to use Trump's phrase, I think they've got that ability.
There must be risks associated with it, though, because surely it ramps up uncertainty, which is generally not good for markets. And also from a strategic point of view, I'd have thought nations will be less willing to strike, trade deals with the US, certainly, but maybe any kind of treaty. Because if the president can just override it with the stroke of a pen, who cares what America writes down on paper, right? And also this geopolitical concern of, are you going to empower China and kind of force countries into their remit?
And this is another point that Gideon Rachman makes, which is a good one, which is that Biden's approach was to collaborate with the EU to try and change China's behavior. So the EU was poised to push through a new investment agreement with China. But by the end of the Biden period, the US and the European Commission were working closely together on efforts to de-risk trade with China and restrict exports of key technology. And he goes even further. He says some influential Europeans are even asking whether the US or China is now the more direct threat. this would have been an absurd question just 2 months ago. But it's Trump, not Xi, who's talking about ending the independence of Canada, which is a NATO member state. And it's Trump and Elon Musk, not the Chinese government, that's promoting the far right in Europe.
And I guess that's potentially another reason why it might be a struggle to keep the EU united against America and their trade war, is that there's a significant minority of member states now who have leadership which are relatively far right themselves and sympathetic to Trump. But as you say, though, the whole question of China and their economic power looms over everything here. And that's actually where the tariffs are going into effect and have gone into effect today. And Beijing has responded with several measures, but which analysts I've seen have been referring to them as restrained. It's a restrained response designed not to antagonize Trump and ratchet this up to the next level.
Like complaining to the WTO, which no longer has the power to do anything about it, largely thanks to Trump.
Yeah, that's definitely a symbolic move. They have brought in some tariffs. It's harder for China to target US goods, though, because they don't import a lot from America. That's why there is this big trade deficit. But they have put 15% tariffs on American coal and natural gas, 10% on crude oil, farm equipment, and some cars. And significantly, those tariffs are not going to come in until the 10th of February. So I think they've given themselves a week to do what Mexico and Canada have done, basically. See if they can forestall this.
Now, if you did want to throw sand into the cogs of the US economy, I think one way to do that is via imports of critical minerals. For example, tungsten, tellurium, ruthenium, molybdenum. This is starting to sound like the Elements song, isn't it?
I've never heard of half of those things. Are they real? What are they, metals? I don't know.
Yeah, rare earth metals. But if you manufacture high-tech products, including chips, of course, they really rely on these minerals.
And China produces a lot of them. I know that.
So tungsten, for example, is useful if you've got something which is exposed to high temperatures because it's got a very high melting point. And it's used in weapons like armor-piercing missiles in the defense industry.
And China has a near monopoly on the supply of tungsten. It accounts for around 80% of the global production. And one of the measures they've announced in response to Trump's tariffs is export controls on all these critical minerals. Because like we said, it's hard for them to fight back tit for tat on tariffs because there's a massive imbalance on trade. So they have to look at things where they do have the upper hand.
And another token thing, given that Google's actually blocked in China anyway, is that they've kicked off an antitrust investigation into Google and Alphabet.
Yeah, I don't really understand that one, given that Google doesn't have much of a presence in China.
But apparently Chinese businesses advertise abroad using Google, so this could hit their profits.
Okay. What do you reckon, though? Is this kind of the sweet spot where China has to be seen to be doing something, but also wants to kind of leave a chance for de-escalation?
Yeah, I've heard a nice metaphor, which is that if Trump punches you in the face and you don't retaliate, he's just going to punch you in the face again, which I think is probably fair.
Maybe just to wrap up then, we should revisit the market reaction, because we said it was small, but it does seem to have a definitive direction when the markets think the trade war is going to escalate, and then a direction when it looks like it's going to de-escalate. Maybe we should just explain what that looks like.
I think the fixed income space is probably the one to focus on. Certainly the long end of the yield curve, we've seen US yields spike, and that's spewed over into the UK yield curve as well. And that's because inflation could be a problem. And if inflation's a problem, then further down the road, we could see the Fed having to reverse its policy stance. So that could also be a big shock for equity markets in the US, particularly growth stocks where the US is so concentrated. So you could see a pathway to equity markets selling off, potentially because of the inflation and the Fed policy response. And of course, then there'd be the pushback from President Trump, who'd try and insist that the Fed should be cutting rates rather than raising them.
The corner of the market which seems to react most quickly is probably the FX market. Like whenever it looks like things are getting worse in terms of a trade war, the dollar seems to strengthen and most other currencies sell off, like the Canadian dollar and the Mexican peso had pretty sharp falls when it looked like these tariffs were going to come in, and then a pretty sharp recovery when they got delayed.
Yep, dollar strengthening is another effect, which is good news if you're a global index investor, because even if the US market wobbles, the equity market, then that's counteracted from a UK perspective by weakening of sterling versus the dollar.
To me, it's small comfort if we have a global trade war and like, woohoo! Weakening sterling's offsetting some of it. But I think if there were to be massive tariffs in place for the long term, the stock market would have to fall, especially companies that are exposed to global trade. Like you'd see big falls, I think, in manufacturing companies. We see it in Europe actually today a bit, where Trump's now talking about the EU and they're the next in line for tariffs. And, European car makers have fallen 5 or 6%.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think it will be sector specific. But given the US concentration in the Mag 7, those companies are probably focusing more on tax cuts. So maybe there'll still be a path for an upward move in equity markets despite tariffs. But I think that's a pretty optimistic take.
It would be kind of crazy if the market can live with all this uncertainty and still keep rising. But then the market has been kind of crazy for the last few years, and I wouldn't rule that out.
Now, I mentioned people were discussing their reaction to the trade war and what they should do about it in their portfolio. Why not join that discussion? If you're worried about it, you can do that by going to our website, pensioncraft.com/membership, to learn more.
Okay, today's dumb question of the week is, how do you measure the strength of a currency? So we hinted at it there, and we said one of the responses when it looks like tariffs are coming in is that the dollar strengthens. But what does that mean? What's dollar getting stronger?
Well, you can always measure it versus single currencies. For example, sterling. That's the way we usually think of it in the UK.
Cable.
Yep, cable is what it used to be called. Still called on some FX desks, which aren't computerized now, where there are still traders. And of course, you've got things like the dollar index, which looks at a trade-weighted basket of the US's trade partners.
Dixie.
And that's called Dixie. DXY, yeah.
Look at me with my lingo.
You've changed, Michael. You've changed.
If only I was a trader in the 1980s, I would have been happy.
I could see you with the slick back hair and the braces, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's one way of looking at it. You can measure it directly, or you could look at it in terms of buying power. So you've got purchasing power parity, and you've got models which tell us how much buying power each currency has if you've got a standardized basket of goods. Tricky because the basket of goods is very different in Beijing than it is in Washington.
But is that basically saying if I want to do my weekly supermarket shop, how many dollars do I need in America? How many yen do I need in Japan? How many pounds in the UK?
Yeah, and to buy that basket of stuff, you'd expect parity because you'd think that what the currency conversion should do is equalize the buying power. And if you want an intuitive way of understanding that, you look at the Big Mac index from The Economist. How many Big Macs can a dollar buy? How many Big Macs can a pound buy? And the fair exchange rate should equate those two Big Mac buying powers.
Is it true that purchasing power parity is trying to come up with a kind of fair price for currencies? So when you do the Big Mac index or the weekly shop index or whatever, the result you get of where the currency should be might differ from what the market exchange rate currently is.
Oh, it's always different, and it's way different in some cases for a very long period of time. The way it works is over a long period of time, you'd expect that it converges on PPP. So all it really does is give you the direction of travel. But the factors that you'd consider when you've got a fair exchange rate model would be things like interest rates. That's the big driver. If you've got a stronger interest rate than other countries, that attracts capital and strengthens your currency. Inflation, GDP growth, trade balances, all of these feed into fair value models for currencies, if you look at it from a fundamental perspective.
And I guess foreign exchange reserves at central banks also play a part because they can work to stop convergence with PPP or whatever other fair value model you look at.
Yeah, that's right. I think if you've got huge reserves, then clearly you've got a way of controlling the currency as well.
Though it is easy to burn through a lot of reserves trying to manipulate an exchange rate.
As we know in the UK, indeed.
People are talking about potential parity between the dollar and the euro as the dollar's getting stronger and the euro is getting weaker. Is this anything other than a kind of symbolic level?
Well, look, I don't think so. I don't think that way. But chartists would probably think so. They talk about resistance levels and psychological limits. But do I believe it? Not really. But could we get parity? Yeah.
But is it not a psychological blow for a European that now our euro is worth less than a dollar?
Well, I think for Germans, they'll be celebrating because they can sell their cars, which then look cheaper to the American consumer.
It's funny, isn't it? Currency moves. It feels to me that whichever way they go, if they go stronger or weaker, people can make the argument, oh, that's good for us.
It's good for someone, always, but it's not good for others, yeah. Exporters and importers.
But as we've said before, I think, as a long-term investor in stocks, for example, it's probably best not to focus too much on currency because I think you've phrased it as it doesn't drift.
Yeah, because equity markets drift upwards at a rate of about 9% per year because that's the nominal growth rate of equity, maybe 8-9%. Whereas if you look at the currency conversion rates, they don't tend to drift long term. Because if they're driven by things like interest rate differentials, growth differentials, inflation differentials, well, in developed markets, those are never that different. And of course, this is why you don't hedge equity funds. You do hedge bond funds because there the volatility is lower. But for equity, it usually doesn't make sense. So I think for most people, they can kind of ignore currency if they are long-term investors.
And if you plan to spend the money eventually in the currency you're invested in. I always think that's an overlooked thing. Like if you're in the UK, but you're planning to retire in Panama, maybe it affects you more.
Yeah, I've often had this discussion with people who are planning to retire somewhere else. They should always think in terms of that currency that they'll ultimately spend it in.
But this is a whole conversation for another day. Thank you for joining us for Many Happy Returns. Keep sending us your questions, no matter how dumb, at mhr@pensioncraft.com.
And do remember to check out pensioncraft.com for all the information about our membership, courses, and investment coaching options.
Many Happy Returns is a PensionCraft production, co-hosted and executive produced by Roman Nakiza and Michael Pugh. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes and is not financial advice. We do not provide recommendations or endorse any decision to buy, sell, or hold any security. We cannot be held responsible for any actions listeners may take, and investors are encouraged to seek independent financial advice.